I'm part of the Disaster and Emergency Management program. I'm a master's student. So I have a question about, I wrote it down, so I'll just say it. So is there any attempt by the EU or any of the governments to strengthen transnational highway or transnational routes, like the stoppage points? Like, I'm thinking like Crises and other points which get a massive amount of migrants. Or has the EU kind of learned their lesson that these smugglers are very smart and that they're not always going to use the same routes?
No, you can pay smugglers to stop doing what they're doing if the incentives are higher than what they would earn from the smuggling or trafficking, right? So this is the reason that the EU or that the Libya-Italy deal worked is because it was basically Gaddafi's security services and his sons who were running the trafficking, who were making a lot of money off the trafficking, and they gave them enough money that they gave them more money than they were making previously, and so they decided to stop it. It's the same thing. We don't really know what happened, but when the previous Italian interior minister, what was that guy's name? No, the ex-communist spy guy. Do you know that guy? He was the interior minister, and he went to Libya in summer of 2017, made some deals with the militias on the coast, and then the numbers dropped radically because he paid them instead of smuggling, paid them to basically be the Coast Guard. And two months ago, a Dutch court indicted and put sanctions on the head of the Libyan Coast Guard because he was trafficking people. The Libyan Coast Guard that the EU created and funded was actively doing trafficking. And the reason they clamped down on that guy is because he wasn't playing by the rules. And then in terms of places like Agadez, I mean, the way that you hear it from people in the European Commission now, the development funding, they say that there's no government in Libya. So what we've done is we've gone on the ground with civil society organizations and municipal actors, this is what they say, and using these ideas around humanitarian development nexus type stuff. If you're in that scene, you'll know what I'm talking about. They say in a month we were able to implement development projects that stopped all the migration through the sale, right? Which is, it's bullshit. There's no possible way, right? They just paid smugglers to not smuggle. One more anecdote is that if you talk to people from the European External Action Service who were working on the Khartoum process is a regional process with all the states from the Horn of Africa involved in the irregular migration systems. They went there. Right now in Sudan, there's something called the Joint Reaction Force, I think. This is the border force in Sudan right now is comprised of the ex-Janjaweed militia who perpetrated the genocide in Darfur. They incorporated them into the military, and that's the irregular migration border force in Sudan now paid for by the European Union. The EAS people tell you that when they first started going into Sudan at the start of the Khartoum process, the Sudanese delegation said, do you have 3 billion euros per year? No, 300 million euros per year. And they said, why? And they said, well, that's how much it'll cost you to make us stop smuggling. This is the government delegation. And they said, oh, that's how much it'll cost, trying to to hedge and be euphemistic, saying, oh, you mean that's how much it'll cost for your robust border controls? No, that's how much we make off the smuggling, and that's how much you're going to have to pay us to pay everybody down the chain to stop smuggling. That's the answer. You can pay people to do whatever you want.
Other questions?
My name is Wonderson. I'm from Disaster and Emergency Management Master's Program. I used to work I'm from East Africa, from Ethiopia. I used to work in refugee response, and I know that there is a approach methodology being planned to implement in terms of integrating the refugee movement with the hosting community and also like solving the pushing factor from the countries. So do you have any like information about the achievement of that strategy, like to stop the secondary movement from the refugee camps?
So the thing he's talking about is, if you're in the refugees, the CRRF, there's this thing, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework that says that you can use development financing, basically, and development mechanisms to empower displaced people and increase the development of host communities and host states to basically ameliorate tensions, but also to incentivize not integration, because they don't like that, but inclusion in host states. And I'm pretty pessimistic in general, but I think Ethiopia is one of the states that's actually very serious about development right now, and is very serious about implementing the CRRF and showing that it can work. Because the thing is that through the World Bank, right, they can access these new financing envelopes. It's a bit arcane, but there's a thing called the IDA 18 refugee sub window that the World Bank has basically said, if you take grants basically to foster these inclusion plans, then you can unlock other development financing for your host state to spend on other projects, not on the refugee projects. So that's their mode of like incentivization from the World Bank. And it's not, I'm not actually, I think that the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework and the Refugee Compact, that we shouldn't be pessimistic about it, because when you talk to people like UNHCR and people that are implementing this stuff on the ground, it's not a pessimistic project. I think it's like a recognition that something needs to change radically and dramatically, and these states are saying that they'll be the host states for it. So I think I'm a bit of a cheerleader for that stuff. The example of where that has worked a lot is, some people say Uganda. It's like refugee self-reliance and creation of refugee economies there. I think that we listen too much to Alex Betts and Paul Collier, who are two refugee scholars, about that stuff, and that there's reason to be a little bit pessimistic about it there. But in Ethiopia, I think the state has the capacity to do it. There's no evidence yet that that's the problem, right? You can't, contrary to what the EU believes, you don't do development in a month, right? So, what do you think?
What about the contributing, the EU contributing for the pushing factor, like for example, like the support Eritrean government, or can be like South Sudan, to control, like to reduce the pushing factor?
Yeah, I mean,
instead of like focusing on like
what do you
the secondary movement.
I want to know what you think, what your experience is.
Like, yeah, I know, like I have the information regarding with the Horn of Africa, specifically the Ethiopia. There is like negotiation and like dealing with the South Sudan, the two parties. So.
I mean, South Sudan just seems like a disaster. I'm not sure how you would go do development finance.
Even in Syria also, like nowadays is good.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing with the Turkey response, right? There's like a trade-off. Do you want people using smugglers and traffickers to try to get into Europe and dying on the way, and fostering anti-EU, anti-immigrant populist parties that's just going to tear down the project? Or do you want to do development work in a place where they're displaced and close to home, but then it's always a cynical exercise of containing migrants, right? There's like it's a dilemma there that you got to make a choice. I don't know.
I'm just getting more and more depressed hearing this. Well, I have a question for Anki's pessimism one later, but I saw two hands going up, one at the very end of the row, and then there's a question over here.
Yeah, so I'm Gareth. You mentioned you did a case study in Morocco. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, and if you feel like your research at all comes into conflict with Heinda Haas's, who I'm sure you're familiar with. He also did Morocco's research to start. It seems like I'd be interested if you feel the way he talks about causation, if you're ever in disagreement with some of the causal theses that he supports.
In terms of the migration development stuff, or the fragmented journeys stuff, or
and anything. I mean, there's a lot on this chart.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I also spent the stuff in Morocco that I did was at the very start of my PhD, the first summer of my PhD, just because I was reading about what was going on there. And so I kind of went to spend 6 weeks there talking to some NGOs and some people who were living in informal camps, kind of mostly from West Africa, who were trying to make it to Europe, but who were functioning. That was 2009. That was this period where that system was basically stuck. I mean, Heinda is right. He did a ton of field research there. I mean, he knows more than I did, and I think you'll see, especially in that chapter, an exhaustive citations of his work for that. But he's right about the fragmented journeys thing, and it's not the case. So in the West African case that I looked at Morocco. In that migration system, you do see a lot more fragmented journeys. You don't see these transnational networks of smugglers and traffickers there. Right. And a lot of that has to do with the domestic characteristics of the states there. So I didn't talk about this stuff, but there's a lot of intervening variables, and one of them is how strong the security apparatuses are there. And yeah, basically there's quite differentiated responses. And a lot of that too is that in Morocco they did make some changes to domestic laws and institutions that marginally increased migrants' rights, but they also allowed in UNHCR can actively operate there, whereas they can't and they don't in Israel. They took away UNHCR's capacities as soon as the migration crisis started. In Egypt, I mean, you said you spent time in Egypt? And if you've seen the UNHCR offices in Cairo, they're pretty swamped. And in Libya, obviously, the UNHCR only has observer status. So those things change the nature of the responses. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
No, I mean, I think I just see a lot of agreement between what you've presented and, maybe if I read the whole thing, I would just see agreement. So I was wondering if you have...
I mean, I learned a lot about what I know about irregular migration in Morocco from Heinda Haas.
Right, so, okay. Yeah. He paints this is kind of not exactly on that, but he paints this rosy picture of circulatory migration, like before Schengen, essentially from Morocco to Spain. Yeah. And of course, I have no... if I guess when he was born, it's wondering if he's just a little bit too rosy on how it all used to work. That's a passing thought. I mean, I'm not an expert in Morocco at all.
Yeah, if you read Bade Klaus Bade. Bade? I knew you were going to say that. Klaus Bade?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he wrote a book about, he's a historian of migration, basically. But he wasn't moving Europeans, that was Leslie Mock. I know, Klaus Bade wrote a book about and Leslie Mock, M-O-C-H. Those are the two historians about European migration history that kind of end their books in that period. And they have the best kind of description of circulatory migration systems.
There was also somebody over here, and then, I thought I saw a hand flicker over there.
Okay, my name is John Nairn, environmental studies, and focusing on refugee migration issues. You mentioned Alexander Beck's and Collier's survival migration.
Yeah.
It seems that they talked about failed states, refugees fleeing failed states, and so forth. And in your presentation, it appears that the deals that were made with Gaddafi, with Italy, and so forth, they were more interested in securing their borders than focusing on international human rights and human rights laws and the treaties that they signed, such as the convention, the 51 Convention. It seems as if that book was thrown out and they were more interested in securing their borders. And, you know, Betts and Collier, they talked about the fact that nobody's interested nowadays to say, create new hard laws.
Yeah.
They talk about soft laws and hard laws and so forth. So in your presentation or in your research, do you find it that Europe or Europeanization, they're more interested in securing borders than recognizing human rights, separating migrants from refugees, for example?
Yeah, 100%. Again, so I said, the best way to look at this is, so they had this thing, and Europe had this, like the ENP, the European Neighbourhood Policy, was the overarching foreign policy framework for the EU. They also had this thing called the GAM, which was the overarching kind of external migration policy. The GAM stands for the Global Approach to Migration and Mobility. And the EU loves pillars, so they had a 3-pillar approach, or 4 pillars in the GAM. Basically, you know, development and migration, increasing civil society and human rights, things like this. And then the justice and home affairs, so the security pillar. So exporting border controls, revamping laws along the lines of European laws. That's one big aspect of Europeanization, kind of emulating European legal categories. If you look at the budget of what they spent in the first 5-year and then second 5-year window of the GAM, right? This is their, and it's all around the frame, it's framed around like harnessing the potential and development, yada yada, migration, and I think it's like 88% of funding went to the security pillar, right? It's like 8 billion euros over 5 years, and then like 11 billion euros over the next 5 years. It went from 88% to 92% of the funding goes to this the hard security stuff. Europe talks about this development migration stuff, but the thing about Europe's migration and development and human rights is that, yeah, they failed at it, but they've never really tried. If they took all the money that they were spending on hard border controls that don't work and that kill people and that incentivize authoritarian regimes, and threw that money into the development side of it, like they said they were going to do with they call it the Trust Fund for Africa, which is 3 billion euros of repackaged development programming that was already happening in Africa anyways. They just called it something else. You can't get development. You can't get 3 billion euros of development funding through any bureaucracy in a month, or have programming to implement it. Maybe if they actually considered using the money for the development things that they say will work, then we would have some evidence about whether or not you could do development to forestall migration. But we don't have any evidence of that because nobody has really tried it yet. The Betts and Collier thing that I said that we shouldn't listen to them is that they have these surveys from Uganda where they paint the rosiest possible picture of what it's like to be a refugee in Uganda. There's a lot of contrary evidence. And then B, Paul Collier has this like he's, I don't know, I guess he's a senior scholar in my field, so on camera, but he's gone off the deep end. And he thinks that you can build like special economic zones and refugee camps to solve everybody's problems, as if multinational corporations should think of refugees as widgets, and that refugees have no agency, and once they make some money, they're not going to use the money to get the hell out of there. Yeah, you can watch this video of Paul Collier giving a talk with the BBC at the Royal United Services Institute, and and see him get taken down pretty well on stage by African development scholars.
There was a hand over here, and, oh, sorry. There was a hand over here, and Michelle had her hand up.
I just have a question when we were looking at like the migration laws and even Schengen zones. Like I feel like even in regards to European citizens, the Schengen zone isn't like open borders. And I was wondering what you came across for like the Roma people migration.
Yeah, I thought you were going to mention.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's functional and institutional racism against Roma people in Europe. And a lot of that is that no access to documentation. And then, you know, people think that this is one of the big reasons that that Serbia and Romania are basically, Romania is, you know, part of the EU and Bulgaria is part of the EU, but they're not part of Schengen. And they think that Serbia will never be part of Schengen is because of the Romanian populations there. There's so much racism against Roma people. You know, recently, Salvini, the interior minister and vice president of Italy, said that they should, in Italy, they need to do like a census of the Roma people to find out who's there, which sounds fascist because it is fascist. Yeah, that's it. You're right. That's the answer. Not equal for everybody.
Yeah.
Michelle?
I've always wondered about the people who actually write these policies. I can appreciate, you know, politicians respond to certain kinds of pressures, but those people that you meet in your conversations with the neck scarves and the high bureaucratic, are like, as human beings, are they true believers, or are they doing what they do but they try to mitigate, or do they do what they do because they know it's unworkable so they just do it anyway, or, you know, what is behind all that?
Yeah, so I think all of that stuff. I mean, the people that you meet in the senior civil service in the EU all have PhDs. It's really hard to get one of these jobs at the top of the EU. They're really smart and they're up to date on the academic literature. You know, and they can talk all the critical theory talk as well. They know the Fortress Europe literature, they know the No Borders literature, etc. It depends like which units you're talking to inside the commission, right? So there's DG, the Director General for Migration and Home Affairs. A lot of the people in there, I mean, they kind of wield ignorance, I think, about what's going on with these policies. There's all the other people from the other DGs, like DG ECHO, which is the humanitarian affairs, DevCo, which is the development side of it. There's the enlargement people. People there have said to me that they consider their job as protecting migrants against DG Home people. But DG Home kind of runs the show. Yeah, and some people are. A lot of people, you know, you meet people in for instance, who like work for ECRI or something like that, who leave the DGs and go to ECRI, or go back to universities because they can't deal with it. Then you meet people that, you know, there's on that chart. There's something called Eurosur, which didn't really take off, but it was this idea to build this kind of like full spectrum like radar surveillance system across the Med, and the guy who was in charge of that was a guy who grew up in East Berlin, and he's like, I grew up behind a wall, we're not trying to build any walls, if we don't manage migration then the right-wing parties win, and so we need to figure out a way to do this that doesn't keep killing migrants in the Mediterranean. But I work inside a bureaucracy and I'm constrained, but I'd rather be here doing the work than be outside criticizing it. So you get all of those things that you would imagine. But the number one takeaway that I have is that there's no like mindless automaton bureaucrats once you get to that level of policy making inside the EU. And the EU, I mean, it's really often like black boxed in the research, right? You just talk about the EU as if it's this monolithic thing. It's really not. And there's a ton of politics going on inside there. So that's, I mean, yeah, I think everything that you would assume is happening. There's all the kinds of people.
We have a few more minutes. I see one more hand in the air, and I have a question as well. So go ahead, and I'll ask my question after.
So my name is Lynn. I'm affiliated to CRS, and I work for Doctors Without Borders. And I appreciate your perspective on the Europeanization and the power that you give to the EU. But you were hinting on now a bit on the politics going on within the European Union, and I would like to hear your perspective on the actual power that it has, because from my perspective, it's the EEAS, for instance, or the European Parliament or the Council. They're very much reliant on the nation states and what they want to do. And while we like to talk about the European deals, the most powerful deals are most of the time the bilateral deals that Germany makes with Eritrea, for instance. Could you build a little bit on that?
No,
Which is totally along the lines of my question, so I'm glad.
No, you're absolutely right. So there's like a big, again, to get back to the IR literature for a second, there's a big question about Europe's actorness in the international system. Definitely the member state deals have the more immediate impact. My argument is that a lot of what's driving it is the compensatory measures for Schengen and for the European project. And this is something that I didn't get to in the presentation. But very often it's the internal solidarity measures, right? And the decision logics that those imply that compels the states to do certain things. So Italy, for example, doesn't want to be Europe's gatekeeper around migration. It doesn't want Dublin returns. Sometimes it's forced to take Dublin returns. Sometimes French soldiers on the border in Ventimiglia shove them back over the border, etc. But it would rather do the work of stopping them in Libya or even further in the Sahel than dealing with them inside Italy. But the logic, a lot of the logic driving it is around what Italy is compelled to do or ought to be compelled to do because it's a member state of the European Union. The counterfactual is, what if you just had a bunch of other states, a bunch of traditional sovereign states that never made the European Union, dealing with irregular migration flows after the end of the Cold War? I mean, it's hard to imagine these counterfactuals, but I don't think that it would look as coherent in the way that Europe can project foreign policy as it does now. That's my take on it.
Can I just push Lynn's point a little bit further? And I recognize there was another hand up there. In the story of Europeanization that you painted, when you were talking about benign versus malignant Europeanization, there is that thing that's missing, all the stuff that did not get Europeanized. So if you're talking about the EU capacity as an actor, there's all this stuff that they can't do because precisely what Lynn just said, because those control, whatever we want to call the powers, are still at the national level, right? So the story of the Europeanization of asylum and migration policy is all the stuff that did not get uploaded and is basically just not there. And so if you talk to all the bureaucrats, they're talking about what they can control, but they cannot make certain kinds of policy because that's just, they don't have the power to do this. So the tragedy of Europe for me is that there's this capacity, it's just not there, because we still are talking at the national level. It's a whole other push and pull, so the EU does not even have the power to paint itself out of this picture, because the actors, the other actors that you're talking about, I study courts, and so I'm thinking about some of the court decisions, some of the activists that have gone to various European courts, so there's something that's shifting, but only since Lisbon, only since 2009, because not even the courts were allowed to review some of these provisions, so there is again, in terms of the capacity, the parliament wasn't even allowed to participate in some of the various treaties, again, until very recently. So there's something that's shifting now, but maybe it's too late. Maybe Europe has to die and the hero has to, I don't know, to go back to your analogy, I don't know how you envision, you know, the rebirth of Europe and maybe some more, you know, open border, kind of happier flowing regime, because I'm the eternal optimist and I cannot walk out of here completely depressed about where I'm from. So I think there has to be something that has to happen. But so I guess I would be curious what your follow-up, like how should this all be reconstructed, and is there any glimmer of hope? So that would be, I guess, what I'd love to finish on, but I want to make sure that since you had your hand up, and I know there was somebody else already trying to get into the room, that we get a last comment and question.
Oh, my question was answered.
I'm not being rude. I'm gonna tell you the quote that I was gonna.
Oh, okay.
So I was trying to remember where I heard this quote as I was reading the tragedy stuff, and I actually just found it right before the talk. I thought it was Norman Finkelstein, but it's this Israeli writer Amos Oz. But just before I get to this, if you look at the way that the Schengen Border Code was uploaded and exported to Central and Eastern European states,
Right.
and the reformulations that they had to make about their borders and what happened on their borders, in the pre-accession period and then during enlargement, that was like where a vast majority of the money and early conditionalities went to that program. It's the fair programming under that. They had to create institutions around asylum and border control from the ground up, right? And that was through twinning projects with the EU. That's the mechanism. It literally didn't exist there before the EU. So that type of Europeanization that happened.
Sure. Sure.
And yes, my claims about malignant Europeanization, I mean, it's not the same Europeanization that scholars talk about in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm saying that these scholars saying, oh, look, none of the Barcelona processing or these democratization processes in the Mediterranean didn't work. I guess there's no Europeanization there. And I'm saying, yeah, there is a lot of Europeanization there. And then when I take that framework and look at Central and Eastern Europe, which is supposed to be this completely rosy picture of the EU's policies, you actually see the emergence of transnational criminal networks, smuggling and trafficking, the corruption of border guards, the corruption of institutions, because they had to become Schengen's gatekeepers. It didn't exist until Europe started doing that stuff. You're right about the common European asylum system and all the stuff domestically in Europe.
There's still no hope here, but
No.
no hope.
Here's the hope.
Okay.
So this is Amos Oz, like a like a left wing but Zionist author, part of like the original kind of like Peace Now movement, etc. The kind of Israeli that there hardly is anymore. So this is him. Anyway, this is him. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a tragedy. A clash between one very powerful, very convincing, very painful claim over this land and another no less powerful, no less convincing claim. Now such a clash between rights claims can be resolved in one of two manners. There's the Shakespeare tradition of resolving a tragedy with a stage hewed with dead bodies and a justice of sort prevails. But there's also the Chekhov tradition. At the conclusion of the tragedy by Chekhov, everyone is disappointed, disillusioned, embittered, heartbroken, but alive. And my colleagues and I have been working, trying not to find the sentimental happy ending, a brotherly love, a sudden honeymoon to the Israeli-Palestinian tragedy, but a Chekhovian ending, which means clenched teeth and compromise. What a lie. And the clenched teeth and compromise is, I think, a smaller European Union with better immigration policies. That means people don't have to use smugglers.
Please join me in thanking Craig for coming up here to